Is the devil real? And hypothetically, if he were real, would he choose to manifest himself in human form in order to manipulate and control the lives of mortals and ultimately influence the course of history? And Satan, is he actually evil, or was his story and his purpose misconstrued from the original biblical texts? Well, those aren't necessarily the questions that the 1993 film adaptation of Needful Things is asking us to consider. But when the devil himself is alleged to have come to Castle Rock, you can't help but wonder what the answers to those questions might be. Or at least I can't help but wonder. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. If you're interested in the novels of Stephen King, horror content, and listening to someone who has recently been accused of looking too deeply into things do exactly that, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. This is the second video in my Needful Things series, which will be taking a look at the 1993 film adaptation. In my last video, I discussed the 1991 novel and the undercurrent of socio-political issues that King addresses within the story, which were likely informed and influenced by the Reagan administration and the rise of the prosperity gospel. That was my best performing video in ages, so thank you to everyone who watched it, to all the new subscribers who found this channel because of that video, and to everyone who took the time to leave comments. Also, I recently, well, when I first started this script, it was recently, so I not so recently joined booktuber, author, and consummate constant reader Church of the Chair for a live stream on his channel. He was kind enough to not only invite me to join him for the stream, but he also sent me the full video so I could upload it on my channel as well. For anyone who would like to check that out, there is a link below. Also, I just got up to 1,000 subscribers, and I want to thank everyone who has recently joined the fun, and an extra big thank you to those who have been here for a while. It's been 3 years now, and I've been plugging away, so this milestone has felt significant and exciting. Okay, so the 1993 Needful Things movie wasn't great, but wasn't entirely terrible, and regardless of its overall quality, it prompted me to ask myself some deep philosophical questions about the existence of evil, of the devil, their physical manifestation, and how were they real flesh and blood beings they might interact with and wreak havoc within the lives of everyday people, and if the devil was ever really evil at all. But before we get into what is most definitely going to be an unhinged philosophical rant about things I can only theorize about, which have found their way into my brain as a result of reading too deeply into a mediocre 90s King film adaptation, let's talk about the film itself for a little while first. Needful Things, 1993 film adaptation. History and background. The screenplay for Needful Things was written by Walter Richter, who also wrote for Invasion of the Body Snatchers, co-wrote Big Trouble in Little China, and most importantly wrote and directed the lesser-known and wonderfully named film The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. The film was directed by Fraser Heston, son of famous actor and political activist Charlton Heston. Fraser Heston had worked on a handful of TV movies and had a second unit director credit on the 1991 comedy City Slickers prior to working on Needful Things. And while Needful Things wasn't Heston's first time working on a film, it was his first time taking the lead in the director's chair. Needful Things was produced by Castle Rock Entertainment, which is, of course, Rob Reiner's King-inspired production company, which produced a number of beloved King film adaptations, including Misery, The Shawshank Redemption, and The Green Mile. The cast was comprised of a number of recognizable faces, including Ed Harris as Sheriff Alan Pangborn, Bonnie Bedelia as Polly Chalmers, Amanda Plummer as Nettie Cobb, and the formidable Max von Sydow as Leland Gaunt. Ed Harris does well in his role, fluctuating between level-headed lawman and hot-headed action hero. There was one scene in particular that I enjoyed where Harris jumps out of his patrol car, kicks the door shut, and one-handed cocks his pump shotgun in one smooth series of movements, all while staring straight ahead. It was pretty slick. As for von Sydow, he can be deviously creepy and intimidating, but he can also be fatherly and kind. His delivery is solid, even if he perhaps didn't have all the best lines to deliver, but he does an admirable job in the role of Gaunt. Production on Needful Things began in November of 1992, and filming wrapped in January of the following year. Filming took place in Gibsons, British Columbia, Canada, but outside of that, there isn't much in the way of details from the production floating around on the internet. I felt the best things the film had to offer, aside from Harris and von Sydow, were its sweeping opening sequence, which was shot from a helicopter and shows some beautiful landscapes. It was honestly reminiscent of the opening It was honestly reminiscent of the opening credits from The Shining. And then there was the epic orchestral score, which was composed by Patrick Doyle. No relation. Doyle's score is huge and terror-invoking when it needs to be, but is also dynamic and has subtle, more delicate moments as well. Following Needful Things, Doyle went on to score some big-name franchise films such as Marvel's Thor and Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Critics of the day were generally unimpressed with Needful Things. Roger Ebert gave the film 1.5 stars and shared some harsh words in his review of the film. A few choice quotes include, quote, "Needful Things is yet another one of those films based on a Stephen King story that inspires you to wonder why his stories don't make better films. And the movie only has one note, which it plays over and over, sort of a satanic water torture. It's not funny, and it's not scary, and it's all sort of depressing," unquote. There was one part of Ebert's review that I found to be rather smug and also just hilariously inaccurate. Ebert states, quote, "The story takes place in one of those peaceable little Stephen King towns where everybody knows each other and they're mostly all doomed. The town is named Castle Rock, after the name of the company that is releasing the film Ho Ho," unquote. Ebert thinks Castle Rock, the town, is named after Reiner's production company, and the addition of the ho ho at the end leads me to believe he thinks that is tacky and unclever. Ebert, you absolute rube, you conceited know-it-all. You think you're slick, but you don't even know the lore of Castle Rock? Some critic you turned out to be. Also, ho ho, what are you, fucking Santa Claus? You embarrassed yourself and now you're dead. Who's ho-hoing now, Roger? Anyway, Ebert wasn't alone, and he was joined by a chorus of underwhelmed critics who were mostly right, in my estimation. The movie isn't bad, but it's one of those forgettable, watch once and never feel the need to watch it again sorts of films for me. Apparently, there was a 3-hour expanded cut that was initially planned to be shown on TV as yet another King-inspired 2-part TV miniseries, and it did in fact air in its uncut form on TBS in 1996, taking up a full 4-hour time period with commercials. The additional hour of material included more characters and their individual stories, extended scenes, and a number of changes from the theatrical release. It turns out someone uploaded the extended cut to YouTube, but I had already watched the 2-hour version when I came across the extended cut, and 2 hours is plenty, so I didn't watch it. Link down below for anyone who actually wants to see that. As for the theatrical release, there were a number of minor changes made from the story of the novel, in particular when it came to what items the characters purchased from Leland Gaunt. For instance, a Mickey Mantle baseball card instead of a Sandy Koufax card, and a high school Letterman jacket instead of a foxtail. But the item had the same effect and significance, which begs the question, why bother changing them at all when the change is ultimately inconsequential? But there were some more major alterations made for the screen adaptation. For instance, the film does away entirely with the integral character Ace Merrill, whose role is instead combined with another character from the film, and there's a refocusing of the main themes from the novel that we'll take a look at in the next segment. Also, the major riot in the streets that takes place when the hordes of Baptists and Catholics clash is replaced by, well, kind of a sudden chaotic mishmash of people that seem to come out of nowhere and just start losing their minds all at the same time. So yeah, this one falls into the meh category for me. It's far from being the worst 90s King film, but it's certainly not among the best either. But that's not to say it's without its merits. What Needful Things did for me was to get me thinking about how Gaunt was referred to as the literal devil come to Castle Rock by Sheriff Pangborn, and I found that to be kind of hilarious. To think that if the devil existed, he would choose to spend his time and immense power fucking with the folks of one specific small town. That seems like pretty small potatoes for the Lord of the Underworld, you know? So let's discuss the devil, what the belief in and the existence of Satan would necessarily signify, and whether or not an almighty being would be caught dead directly messing around with the world of the living on such a small scale. But first, won't you please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and watching as I devolve further into completely theoretical nonsense and religious mythology that may or may not have anything to do with the movie I'm supposedly discussing. Thanks in advance. The devil himself. The religious themes, while certainly present in King's story, are more overt in this movie than they were in the novel. Meanwhile, the political and socio-economic critiques are dialed back to the point that they're not really an integral theme, and that's okay. I can understand why trying to make a film with an undercurrent of Reagan-era neoliberal economic policy critiques would not necessarily translate well. So, yeah. Instead, the film goes more aggressively after the religious themes of the novel. In the film, Gaunt is referred to as the devil on a number of occasions, and when Sheriff Pangborn visits Father Meehan at the Catholic Church, he flat out tells him that the devil, in the form of Leland Gaunt, is residing in Castle Rock. The father is, of course, adamant that Pangborn is incorrect about his accusations against Gaunt, but not because the father genuinely disagrees with him. No, he disagrees because the father has also been a patron of Needful Things, and like most residents of the Rock, has done a favor for Gaunt in exchange for an item he is currently transfixed by and obsessing over. And the father's fellow man of faith and arch nemesis, the Reverend Willie Rose, has likewise partaken in a transaction with Gaunt. The two leaders of the opposing churches are both in cahoots with Gaunt. They have allowed themselves to be led astray and, in a sense, have pledged allegiance to Gaunt in exchange for their item of choice, while Gaunt is covertly pitting them against each other. So you have the representation of the corruption of religious institutions and of different sects and denominations of the church in opposition to each other despite their similarities and supposed worship of the same God. And as I mentioned, Sheriff Pangborn comes to believe that Gaunt is the literal devil in the flesh. At one point, while snooping around in the basement of Needful Things, illegally might I add, because he definitely didn't have a warrant, Pangborn comes across a stack of newspapers, some of which are quite old. As he rifles through the newspapers, he sees headline after headline of some of the world's most historic tragedies: the Nazi invasion of Austria, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the assassination of JFK, and there amongst the pile is a brand new copy of the Castle Rock Call, with the headline, "Two Killed in Castle Rock Double Murder," with photos of Nettie Cobb and Wilma Jerzyk, the first of Gaunt's many local victims, below the headline. Pangborn surmises that Gaunt, having collected this scrapbook of sorts containing all these historic events, with the inclusion of the Castle Rock double murder, well, that must mean that Gaunt was there for all of them, that he played some integral role in each instance, that Gaunt was the puppet master pulling the strings during some of the most devastating events in world history, and now the devil is here in Castle Rock to wreak havoc and cause chaos. So then, why would he be in Castle Rock? Why would someone with the power to influence and orchestrate such major catastrophic events decide to scale back to some small town shenanigans? I'm just saying, after the plague, the Nazis, the atomic bomb, it seems rather unambitious to be meddling in the lives of the folks in Castle Rock. I mean, perhaps Satan has gotten lazy in his old age? Anyway, in the novel, Pangborn doesn't really begin to fully understand the nature of Leland Gaunt until the very end, and he never outright accuses Gaunt of being Satan. But in the film, we are led to believe that Gaunt is the literal devil, as Pangborn suspects. But the games and trickery that Gaunt gets up to in Needful Things sure doesn't sound like the work of the almighty evil Christian deity. Or at least, I didn't think so at first. As I was looking for biblical examples of Satan in the role of the trickster and other trickster gods, I came across an interesting article, or rather it was a conversation between a father and son in the form of an article on a website entitled bycommonconsent.com. The About section of the site describes it as follows. By Common Consent, or BCC, was started in 2004 by a group of Mormons to provide a thoughtful, enjoyable, and reasonable place to post and discuss Mormon topics. Over time, we have added new contributors who share this vision. We seek truth, reason, and honesty with our perspectives on faith. However, BCC is a place of charitable discussion for everyone, including those who are not Mormon. We invite you to read past posts and join in the discussion. Now, mind you, I wouldn't typically seek out information on what is essentially a Mormon blog site, but I honestly wasn't finding what I was looking for when I Googled what tricks did the devil play, and this random Mormon kind of explained why I wasn't finding anything. This article was shared by a guy named Michael Austin. Austin is a former English professor and has 2 unspecified degrees, so I'm not necessarily saying he's an authority on the topic at hand, but his thoughts on Satan as a trickster, an agent of chaos, rather than an evil, hell-dwelling prince of darkness were insightful and, from what I can tell, not inaccurate. It's a rather lengthy article, so I'll be cutting it down to only the most important parts, but it's still a lot. Austin writes, quote, "Even in the book of Job, which was written around 500 years after the earliest Genesis texts, Satan is not yet the prince of darkness. He is not even Satan. He is the Satan, a member of God's court who functions something like a prosecuting attorney combined with a store detective. He goes throughout the kingdom looking for people who are disloyal to the king, God in this case, and then prosecutes them before God for their disloyalty. So we risk misreading the opening chapters of Genesis rather badly if we insist on seeing the serpent as a figure of ultimate evil. That is what the Christian and Mormon traditions have made the story, but it was not at all what the people who first told the story had in mind. To understand what they did have in mind, we need to talk for a minute about the trickster, a character type in nearly every culture's folklore. The trickster is an agent of neither good nor evil. Rather, he, and very infrequently she, introduces chaos and randomness into a system that is stable and predictable. Tricksters are extremely important to the narrative component of mythic beliefs. Without them, there can be no story, just a lot of perfect gods and perfect people being perfect. This is why I think that it is important to understand the creation story in Genesis as a trickster story. When we read it this way, we see something very different than the normal Christian version of the story, which is so concerned with fitting a later version of Satan into the story that it misses almost everything important about it. Tricksters, as I said, introduce chaos and randomness into an otherwise stable order. In terms of narrative, stable orders are no good. They're predictable, stagnant, and boring. The Eden of Genesis is as stable as stories get. Nobody worked, nobody got sick, nobody did much of anything. And noticeably, there were no other characters in the drama, just Adam, Eve, and a perfect God. And then the serpent shows up, and all of a sudden, we get a story. Things happen, the plot moves forward, Adam and Eve come into conflict with God, and then they have children, and we get all the bad stuff like murder and sex. And I don't know why he listed that as a bad thing. Like murder and sex and incest and death and destruction. But we also get all of the good stuff like covenants and chosen people and prophets and sex, if you ask me. But more than anything else, we get stuff. Stories. People to whom things happen. Without the serpent, the Bible would have been a very boring book, and human life would have been very boring too. Just a couple of people in a garden eating all of the approved fruits who didn't even know that they were naked. Unquote. That was a long quote. You probably didn't even remember I was quoting somebody. So according to Austin's interpretation, Satan is and always was intended to be the trickster in the Bible, the one who moves the plot forward, the one who introduces randomness and chaos, the one who makes the stories happen. Austin posits that Satan has since been misinterpreted as some sort of malevolent force, and one that was likely misinterpreted intentionally over the centuries. And from what I can tell, that's exactly right. According to Britannica.com, only in post-biblical Judaism does the devil become the adversary of God. Through the influence of the dualistic thinking of Zoroastrian religion during the Babylonian exile in Persia, Satan took on features of a counter-god in late Judaism. In other words, Satan's not a bad guy, he's just misunderstood. Now, when I started working on this script, it was my intention to argue that Gaunt was not Satan as Pangborn believed, but rather that Gaunt was likely one of mythology's many trickster gods. You know, like Loki, who's probably the most well-known of the merry pranksters, or Anansi, who's the spider trickster of African lore, and then there's like the Greek goddess Eris, just to name a few. But that was before I read Austin's interpretation of what the serpent and the Satan were initially intended to represent, and then found corroborating articles from more reputable sources that further reinforced that as a historically accurate claim. Media literacy, folks. Media literacy, folks. You gotta love it. And so, having grown up in the Methodist Church, I was only aware of that post-biblical Judeo-Christian reading of the devil, that he was the counter-god, the embodiment of evil, but that's not who the devil was initially, not who Satan was initially. Religious sects and institutions changed the meaning and the texts over time to suit their own needs in order to manipulate and subjugate the citizenry by instilling fear through the threat of damnation and spending an eternity in a lake of fire licking Satan's big old sexy hooves. I know, I'm shocked too. Now, all of this biblical Satan stuff is, of course, theoretical, hypothetical, religious mythology and folklore that may or may not be based in reality, and was perhaps the longest possible way of me concluding that, yeah, maybe Gaunt is supposed to be the actual devil. look, I warned you like 3 times in advance that I was going to look too deeply into things and go on a nonsensical tangent. I'm not sorry, and I don't know why I'm like this either. I guess I just like to inject a little randomness, a little chaos into things.
I am the Satan.
Final thoughts. The 1993 Needful Things film adaptation is fine. It's a middle-of-the-road King adaptation that I didn't hate, and on this channel, that's a win. Do I recommend you watch it? Well, there are certainly worse ways to spend your time, so if you're interested, I've left both the link to the theatrical release as well as the link to the extended version below, but personally, I enjoyed learning about the history and reinterpretations of the Satan more, so I left the link to Michael Austin's article down there as well. In my next video, I'll be checking out the 1992 film Sleepwalkers, which was written by King, directed by regular King collaborator Mick Garris, and has been called, quote, an idiotic horror potboiler, unquote, by Variety, and, quote, absurdly unscary and confusingly dull, unquote, by Radio Times Magazine. So, very exciting stuff. I guess we'll see what that's all about. Thank you for watching. Click the buttons, and I'll stop. You bip bip boo. I'll see you next time. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King. I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.